Hey, I'm back, and only in a little bit of odd voice. But don't worry. In honor of the title of this ep, I'm going to encourage you to check out one of my favorite complete escapist podcasts. And this is in pure admiration and entirely unsolicited. Sweet Bitter, the only podcast for a deep dive on Sappho with more context than you ever thought possible, and then pirates. Now back to the regular stuff. Episode 54. 18th Century Oranges. Bitter, not sweet. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I'll be looking at how the orange existed in 18th century colonial America and sharing a fair amount of orange history. While the orange is a commonplace item in our modern world, in the 18th century, it was a symbol of power, both as food and in political circles. To learn of the tastes and emotions tied up with the orange, pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. Before I get started, if you're up to date on the feed, this is a week late because I got flattened with COVID for several days and then my voice sounded like speeded up Sylvester Stallone. Fortunately, I've had my shot, so it wasn't as bad as it could have been. I got to keep my taste and smell, but now I'm back, so let's go. The first thing you need to know is that oranges in 18th century colonial America would have probably have been even rarer than lemons. But they were around if you were rich enough. In those circles where they did exist, they were likely more common than pineapples. But for the little people, they were rare indeed, often to the point of non-existence. But I bring them up for a few reasons. For people that had grown up in England, as middle-class people or even poor city people, they might have crossed paths with oranges. As a winter-oriented fruit, they were a somewhat obtainable luxury around Christmas. Ships carrying Spanish goods would bring them on speculation, so there were opportunities to encounter oranges. They also featured in art, coats of arms, as for William of Orange or William II with his Queen Mary, who had come in to clean up the embarrassing Charles's and James's Stuart messes. So most early colonists knew of oranges even if they didn't actually know what they tasted like, and they were part of the luxury currency of the smuggler and pirate trade that was running around the Caribbean Sea as well as the global ocean trade, especially since enjoying oranges at this stage also required access to sugar. So the orange is a significant item for Stede Bonnet and Blackbeard in real life, and in modern digital color is not drawing outside the lines. I'll start with the word. The name orange is a curious thing, and how it entered into the Western lexicon as fruit, color, and royal house are worth exploring. Until the 16th century, there was no English word for that color between yellow and red except for terms like red-yellow and yellow-red. The first instance of orange in English writing doesn't occur until 1512. The word itself is from a variety of roots in India and the islands to its east, where versions of the word naranja coalesced into the form which would be carried west. There are even early Chinese poems that speak of yellow oranges, where of course the English word stands in for the Chinese name for the fruit. But it means orange did not become its own color until later, and not just in English, but in other places as well. Naranja and laranja are more or less the forms of the word orange that traveled with the Islamic Empire, and all the European places touched by it now use a word close to that. And then, by a game of telephone, the regions that touched those regions ended up with a word more like the English word orange, the N or L dropping off because it sounded like an article. So to oversimplify things, a naranja became an orange. Now in Spain, that was Al-Andalus, under the Caliphate when the orange arrived, retains naranja. And the Portuguese language retains laranja. French has orange, and you can hear that's an orange or c'est une orange that would cause that wandering first consonant. Italy got oranges from across the Mediterranean and retains arancia. But not all of Europe got hold of the orange via the Islamic traders around the Mediterranean. The Dutch word is sinaasappel, and in German, the word is apfelsine. Wait, what? Just as with the tea and cha issue, arrival method mattered. The Dutch first really encountered oranges in their ocean trading adventures, just as they picked up tea alongside the spice trading they did in Java/Batavia. That's where they seem to have also first encountered this curious Chinese apple. So sinaasappel is Chinese apple, and the German is, well, Apfelsine. It's that sine or sina, as in Camellia sinensis, which means from or of China. But curiously, both languages use the word orange for the color. And speaking of colors in Holland and the Dutch, why are their colors blue and orange? And how did they end up sending their Prince William to England from the House of Orange if they say sinaasappel? Celtic water gods, of course. In France, back when it was divided up into provinces rather than the current département, there was the province of Orange. Originally, it had a name closer to Arsion, from the Celtic water god Arasio. Wait, you ask, French Celts? Well, to be fair, at this point they were Gaul and not the Franks or the French, and it was all Asterix and Vercingetorix stuff, the comics you read if you took high school French in America. Back when they were hauling standing stones and talking with the British Merlins, if I remember my comics correctly. Anyway, something Romans, the Germanic Franks came in, and then Charlemagne and the whole Carolingian action series. At the end of it all, we speak of Charlemagne and his descendants as Carolingian. And now we have Arusio, Arausio, and it slides into Orangia. Have I mentioned that not many people were writing or were literate around the 7th and 8th centuries in France? Well, they were not. So by the time writing picked back up, what with record keeping and stuff as the Holy Roman Empire started exercising sway between the 12th and 16th centuries, the Naranja and Laranja from across the Pyrenees had started to trickle in, by reputation, if in no other way. See, Charles Martel may have stopped the spread of the Muslim world at the Pyrenees, but no one was going to stop interesting food from making its way to French royal tables. Also, Catherine de' Medici, when she brought her fork with her to the court of French Charles II, she probably also would have had access to the Italian arancia. Anyway, by the time lots of people got back to writing, the Catholic Church and sumptuous banquet tables with this exotic fruit were in effect. So Celtic water gods were out, and the French province of Orange, Orange, appeared in the records. And this is where the title of the Dutch House of Orange springs from. Yes, because European royalty had been marrying each other like crazy for approximately 1,000 years. By the time we get to the end of the 17th century, obviously, the Dutch royal ruling house is named after a southern French province that used to be named after a Celtic water god. The final result is that William of Orange, by the time he comes to the English throne, has 3 golden oranges on his coat of arms. New Amsterdam has ties to the House of Orange, and all the way here in the 21st century, the sports teams of New York City, the Mets, the Knickerbockers, well, now the Knicks, and the used-to-be New York Giants that deserted to go to San Francisco, all have orange and blue as their colors, honoring their Dutch House of Orange past. It's pretty wild. But that's enough about the word. Now, onto the fruit. The orange of colonial America was the bitter or sour orange, and in England and the colonies was typically known as the Civil or Seville orange. The name derives from the usual port of Spanish departure, Sevilla. While over 2/3 of all citrus grown in the world is now sweet oranges, it was not that way before the 20th century. The sweet orange didn't even make it to Europe until the 17th century, and then only as a royal curiosity, probably to just hang out with the wildly expensive and pampered pineapples. The 19th century commercialized American version would come to be known as the Valencia orange, in company with hundreds of other hybrids over the years. The sour orange spread widely in the Caribbean, Florida, and South America in the 16th century with the Spanish, and it looks like some sweet oranges made their way over here in the early 18th century to some of these areas. But sweet oranges don't make it out of the Spanish territories and into America until the end of the 19th century. So in this installment, when I say orange, I will only mean the bitter orange or the Seville orange. And these oranges, like lemons, are a hybrid of the ancient proto-citrus species. Oranges are not mandarins. While in modern practice, mandarin orange is a common name, the two are actually two very different things. See, now that we have Linnaeus on board, the binomial naming system is going to keep popping up here and there. Mandarins are Citrus reticulata, and among many things are known for their thin, loose skins, thin pith, easy to split segments, and the fact that they bruise easily, which has historically made their transport difficult. But when they were crossed with a pomelo, that fragility problem was addressed. Now, the pomelo is a fairly unfamiliar citrus in North America, but it, Citrus maxima, has a remarkably thick pith, making it a hardier traveler. Where mandarins generally look more like a slightly squashed sphere, pomelos are spherical or a bit pear-shaped. They have a yellowish-green skin and usually a pale, whitish yellow flesh. The pith is usually an inch or a few centimeters thick around the fruit, making the whole pomelo package look like a double-sized softball, something a child would have to hold in both hands. But that's enough about them now. Pomelos are important in making oranges the hardy travelers they needed to be for life on the wild ocean. And we'll talk more about the pomelo in detail when grapefruits arrive in America. So these hybrid bitter oranges are known as Citrus X aurantium, the X designating its hybrid status. As with lemons, they traveled across Central Asia from their origins in Western China and Eastern India to land in the gardens of the 10th and 11th century gardens of the expanding Islamic Empire. As I mentioned earlier, oranges got into Europe via Muslim Spain, but they also arrived alongside lemons and made their way into Europe through Sicily and the Italian boot. The development of the bergamot orange, the fragrant part of Earl Grey tea, and important in many perfumes, attest to this as it appears to be the hybrid of lemon and the bitter orange. From southern Italy, the bitter orange made its way across France, where it met up with the oranges that had been trickling over the Pyrenees from Spain. France took them up, and they made their way to England along with the lemons and citrons of earlier episodes. While the pulp is drier than sweet oranges and not pleasant to eat, it is a tasty ingredient in many sauces, and the pulp and peel were cooked together to make the now familiar and rather famous marmalade. The early Spanish ventures in sugar making, made possible by the technology and botanical imports of the Muslims during the years of the Spanish existence as Al-Andalus, also meant that the Iberian Peninsula got out of the gate early, making thick fruit jellies. A particular Spanish specialty was, and still is, quince cheese or quince paste. Quince look a lot like pears, but ripe quince is mostly hard and inedible. It needs to be hit by frost and decay a bit to soften and sweeten, the same as with medlars and persimmons. After this happens, it can be stewed and added to savory dishes just as apples and pears and dried fruit are, or it can be cooked down into a very thick, orangey pink jam with sugar. This last preparation was the most popular, and even now continues to be used as a filling for pastries and eaten with the strong, salty aged sheep, goat, and cow cheeses of the Iberian Peninsula. This very weekend, you can go out and make yourself a tasty treat of quince cheese and some manchego or torta de la serena cheese and maybe some hazelnuts to go along with them. The important thing here, beyond the jam cooking method, is the name. I've mentioned in passing that the Iberian Peninsula was the New World of the Old World, so had languages of its own, but then they were overtaken and stirred in with the languages of the invaders. The very thick jam, or quince cheese, goes by several names in different Spanish dialects: dulce de membrillo and condonat and marmelo. But on the global stage, it tended to be known by its Portuguese name of marmalada. As a fine, fancy, flavorful, and most importantly, barrel-on-a-boat stable thing, marmalada was spread about all the world by Portuguese and then later Spanish sailors. Just the same as with things like linguiça and longaniza sausages and later ketchup, sesame seeds, and Madeira wine. Now, if you're Googling around, you might come across a few other legends of the origins of orange marmalade. The Scots are very proud of their domination of the orange marmalade category, so seem to have come up with a couple of retcon legends to try to claim its invention. One is that it comes from Mary Queen of Scots feeling ill during her childhood French adventures, and that an orange sweet was made for her as the phrase Marie est malade was spoken while stirring it, and thus giving it its name. This is bunk for a list of reasons, the most straightforward of which being that the French don't even call marmalade. It's known in France as confiture d'orange or pâté d'orange, depending on its thickness. A second legend was that it was invented by James Keeler's mother, Janet. Keeler's Dundee Marmalade was the first commercial brand of orange marmalade sold in Britain, starting in the 18th century. But here it was editing, not invention. Early marmalades were strained of all peel and pith, so they were a smooth paste or cheese just like the original quince membrillo or marmalada. The Keelers were already confectioners, which is why they had massive amounts of sugar, large copper kettles, recipes, and a distribution network at hand. The printing press of the 18th century didn't just spread ideas, it also made for the first widely known brands. And it was definitely a feature of the emerging 18th and 19th century food brands to claim invention of their product. This will come up often as we look at the selling of shelf-stable food products. Anyway, while the Keeler family didn't invent marmalade, they seem to have altered the recipe or made the most of a local version known as chip marmalade. This was where a thin or later thick shards of peel were left in the finished product. Why isn't entirely clear, though there are contemporary claims that the peel would aid in digestion. And the resulting thinner, more spreadable marmalade became all the rage to top muffins and later that whimsical colonial curiosity, toast. Just ask Paddington Bear. The first English-language orange marmalade recipes are found in the late 15th century. Also putting the lie to the Mary Queen of Scots bit, she wasn't in France until 1548. So, after those late 15th and early 16th century English-language recipes appeared. They specifically called out a marmalette of oranges and existed alongside marmalettes of quince, lemons, mulberries, and pippins, that is, apples, as well as restorative marmalettes made of such exotic precious things as ginger, citron, oringo roots, and nut meats. And then there's even the marmalade of eggs, the Jew's way, in the 1769 edition of The Art of Cooking Made Plain and Easy by Hannah Glass. Instead of cooking oranges with sugar to a thick paste, 24 egg yolks are cooked thick with a pound of clarified sugar and an ounce of pounded blanched almonds. It's flavored with orange flower water and cinnamon, and serving directions, dish into small teacups, imply that it sits in the sweets or pudding course. However, it was also suggested as a binder for an almond paste. Add pounded almonds and orange or citron peel and make into small cakes or shape into small birds, fish, or fruit. So the technique of making marmalada or marmalette was applied to several things, not just oranges. In this light, the modern trend of making marmalades of things like onions and oxtails, very cooked down foods suspended in a sweet tart thickened liquid, holds up. Marmalading, once applied to oranges, made it a method more than a specific item. Incidentally, This makes the Cuban and Brazilian guava paste a marmalade cousin, and I cannot recommend a guava and cheese pastelito or empanada highly enough. But again, back to oranges. Along with marmalades, the bitter oranges were squeezed into sauces and marinades, just as their lemon cousins were. A neck of mutton stew made with oranges and raisins harkens back to the Persian-influenced cookery of the form of curry. Bitter orange peel and lemon peel are mentioned as interchangeable in many savory 18th century recipes. However, the less bitter and juicier nature of the lemon made it a more favorable companion to fish and oysters. The more complex nature of the orange made it more favorable in stews and pies. Sugar-covered orange peel chips and orange peel suckets, pieces swimming in thick sugar syrup, were special treats in the "We Have Sugar in Our Kitchen" set. Orange puddings and syllabubs and custards and fools were also constructed. These are all mixtures of varying amounts of egg yolks, cream, and sometimes dried cake or biscuit crumbs that were mixed with syrupy fruit mixtures. And to really show off, oranges were pared of their peels, the centers carefully poked with bodkins to remove seeds, and the entire whole fruits were boiled and suspended in thick sugar syrups to be enjoyed across the year. But again, imported fruit and high cones of sugar were the playthings of the wealthiest of the wealthy. Colonial families like the Custis, the Schuylers, the Lorens, the Byrds, the Jeffersons, and the Washingtons. The orange in its straightforward form was supported by two orange flavor boosters, orange oil and orange flower water. Most European orange oil was made by heating orange peels in olive oil that was suspended in a hot water bath. In some parts of Europe, mostly closer to the Arab world, orange oil might be distilled, but that was a skill largely lost to our colonists. It was too fiddly and required delicate equipment and time the colonists mostly didn't have at this point. But the steeped orange oil was used as both a perfume and a flavoring. Since it was dependent on the oils in the orange skin, it had a strong and rather bitter flavor when tasted directly, but worked functionally like modern orange extract. And since it was an oil, it was not particularly subject to oxidation and lasted well. But because it required fabulously expensive olive oil to make it, which made it even more fabulously expensive than olive oil itself, it had a limited presence. So for practical purposes, it pretty much didn't exist in the up-and-coming colonies. The things that might have had a bit more presence were pomades and pomades. These were lard-based substances that were made by melting very clean lard and letting orange peels infuse in that fat. Pomades were perfume discs and objects that could be carried around to deal with the smelliness of a city, manor, or castle life. Just as an example, pooping under the stairs was common in Versailles at this stage in history, as there were only about 4 things that qualified as bathroom facilities anywhere in the castle, and many an 18th century person who had access to soap and water and body servants avoided bathing due to different interpretations of humorism and religious doctrine. Pomades were combinations of fats and waxes and scents used to clean and style hair, along with powder, leading to many of the late 18th century depictions of whitish and very high hair of the fine and fancy men and women of the 18th century colonies. Shampoo or any form of soap or detergent that would be used on hair completely did not exist in any form at all in Western Europe at this time. It was all combs, pomades, and powder. The second orange flavor booster is still available today, but not in regular American grocery stores. Rather, you'll need to look in Middle Eastern and South Asian groceries. This is orange flower water. The orange flower has long been appreciated for its sweet perfume and the sturdy, slightly waxy nature of blooms found on all citrus trees means they have long been a candidate for both extraction and candying. The trees within the citrus genus are almost entirely interfertile. That means any one species, like the mandarin or the citron or the macrote lime, will almost always produce viable offspring when crossed with any other sort of citrus tree. Practically, that means a cross would produce a fruit with viable seeds that can grow into a whole new functioning tree. And this holds true for all the hybrid varieties as well. However, citrus trees are also capable of self-fertilizing. In fact, that is what they usually do. These self-offspring produced are extremely similar to the parent tree, but are not clones. They're not identical because they are the product of sexual reproduction, not cellular budding. In familiar terms, that means the seeds would be more like fraternal twins of the parent tree than identical twins. Because there is a combination of pollen or the male gamete and the egg, that is the protoseed or female gamete, there will always be some sort of recombination of genes, and that always introduces variability into the offspring. So when a desirable variety has been created, self-fertilization still introduces a bit of risk into production of the expected fruit, which means using grafting over seed planting wasn't absolutely essential in spreading citrus varieties the way it was with apples, but it was still the preferred method. And also explains how in the world you can have so many seedless clementines and grapefruits. Which leads me all the way down to the end, where nearly all citrus flowers are simply lumped together under the name orange flower, because they are so similar in scent and appearance. So orange flower or orange blossom often really means citrus blossom, because we simply like the name orange blossom better. Now, these blossoms were often candied and used as the usual confits and toppings for desserts, as well as being used for extraction to make a hydrosol. That's just a fancy name for the resulting liquid that is known as orange flower water. As an extract, it does smell better than it tastes. It's sweet with a spicy bitter edge, but added to lemon or lime-flavored sweets like sherbets, pies, custard, and cakes, it gives a full, sweeter, and more rounded floral flavor overall. For example, a splash of orange flower water in the orange juice to be used in a mimosa turns that drink into something that's just a little more special. Now, orange flower water would have been in circulation in Europe, the Spanish and Portuguese New World, the Caribbean, but only available in the very fanciest colonial kitchens. Likely those that had close connections to the Caribbean sugar plantations where it was made, or to the Dutch Caribbean where other citrus-based alchemy was afoot. And if we're talking about the Dutch and the Caribbean, you know from earlier episodes we're talking about northern Brazil and the island of Curaçao. Because along with having ties to Orange in France, the Netherlands had been a part of Spain until the end of the 16th century when, yes, the House of Orange was instrumental in booting the Spanish out. One of the long tales of that conflict ended up changing the fate of the island of Curaçao. Originally, this island sitting atop the South American continent just north of Venezuela was home to the Arawak peoples. It was then colonized by the Spanish at the end of the 15th century. After the Spanish were booted from the Low Countries, the Dutch took over the running of Curaçao and a few other islands in the area. The important part here is that the Spanish had imported plants and animals to the island, including lemon and orange trees. During the years of turmoil and neglect, the imported flora and fauna made all sorts of uncontrolled hybrids. The resulting cows were mainly eaten up by the Dutch soldiers, but the oranges recombined into a unique variety known as Naranja. See, that old Portuguese name got run through the telephone game again. Under Dutch rule, Curaçao was made into an important trading hub for salt, sugar, molasses, rum, enslaved Africans, and probably a decent share of the plundered Spanish silver. The Dutch West India Company, the WIC, was chartered in 1621, and over time it would engage in legal-ish, and flat-out piratical trade with the North American colonies to bring them lemons and get around all those annoying English navigation acts. The WIC was, of course, balanced out by the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, that was responsible for tea and spices that we talked about before. And just for fun, Peter Stuyvesant, he was governor of Curaçao for 2 years before he moved up to run the show in New Netherland and New Amsterdam, which he would have to turn over to the England and see it turned into New York in 1664. Anyway, just as the Dutch had introduced gin to the British while booting the Spanish out of Holland, the same pride in distilling alcohol and infusing it with flavors that was at work back in the home country came into play in this island outpost. The Bols family, B-O-L-S, yes, that Bols that makes all those mixer alcohol liqueur flavors, was already a distilling powerhouse at this point and invested in both the VOC and the WIC. So while they were using grain alcohol from wheat and rye as the base for European gin, they saw the potential in sugar and molasses and turned to them to create a Curaçao liquor business. Multiple distilling the molasses sea, kill devil, or rum made a clear, less horrible liquor that was begging to be flavored. And the bitter Naranja orange of the island was a perfect candidate. The pith and fruit as something just to eat were frankly pretty awful, but the peel was particularly aromatic. And so while the Dutch were distilling the orange-flavored alcohol, they used some of the same distilling technology to make orange flower water. Roses grew in England and the 18th century North American British colonies. Those ladies could make their own rose water. But the orange blossoms of the Caribbean could be used to make orange flower water to go along with the Curaçao orange brandy the Dutch started sending up with their molasses, pineapples, lemons, and other smuggled finery. What of blue Curaçao, you ask? I say, hold your horses. That is a 20th century madness, and you'll just have to hold on. So, that is 18th century oranges. In the meantime, consider an orange syllabub or an orange fool. Since it can be practically impossible to find any of the proper sour or Seville oranges, look for cans of Seville orange pulp, or pull the jelly part out of some orange marmalade. Or you can use sweet oranges, just hold back on the sugar. Each approach will produce a different flavor, but the ones that start with bitter oranges will produce something closer to the complex, bitter-tinged tastes of yore. And if you're feeling adventurous, check around in Latin markets. They may carry bitter oranges, especially in the winter. And I'll put links to some likely recipes in the show notes. Next time, COVID got me and is messing up my schedule on top of my already planned absence in August. So anyway, next time it's legumes. Time to check in on the American bean seed. And this will include not just the New World kidney Phaseolus beans and the European fabas. Now we have the small beans of Africa, and this gave me a shock: soybeans. So hang on for the surprises of the lives of the legumes. Thanks for listening. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Any email questions or quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. A few words to review this podcast really do make a difference and help me make sure I'm still heading in an interesting direction. Along with the promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting media I consume for the episode. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. And the link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter bio at THOA Food and on Instagram in the same place. And of course, in the show description.